if India wishes to reclaim the civilizational state in the context of decolonization as against post-colonialism, uh, while at the same time capture some aspects of the modern, rational, Western, secular concepts such as the sovereignty of individual or separation of religion and state, where do we start? What would you say?
Allow me to disagree with the premise of your question itself, which is to say your question has two parts. One is that we start on a decolonial journey and also take certain aspects of modern, liberal, Western society, which includes the separation of the state and religion. There is a serious problem with the question for the simple reason that you proceed on the assumption that the separation of the state from the religion is something that is universal. When in fact, in the book I've specifically addressed this to make the point that it is not universal, it is specifically traceable to Christian political theology. And therefore, before a non-Christian society embarks upon a decolonial journey, it has to ask itself whether it really wants to be governed by that particular principle. So, the desirability of it is the question that needs to be addressed first. And second, whether this is consistent with your own ethos is a question that you have to answer. And I refuse to use the word modern, especially after this particular book. I would prefer to use the word contemporary as a substitute for modern, because modernity as a concept and as a word has significant colonial interpretations. Someone might say it's possible to divorce the word from its meaning, but that would be fundamentally stupid and illogical for a different reason. So a few days ago, I just began my training in Sanskrit, and one of my teachers ended up initiating me into something which is one of the verses from Kalidasa's Raghuvamsam. It goes something like this: Vagarthaviva sampraktau, Vagartha pratipattaye, Jagatah pitarau vande, Parvati Parameshwaram. So I ended up asking him, what is the meaning of this? Vagarthaviva sampraktau. So that's the first sentence. Vak and Artha. The word and its meaning, sampraktau, they are enmeshed, they are inseparable. Vagartha pratipattaye. So you're asking the deities, namely Shiva and Parvati, to bless you with the ability to attain that state where you never understand a word independent of its meaning, and whenever you understand a word, you always understand it with the meaning. So, Vagarthaviva sampraktau, Vagartha pratipattaye, Jagatah pitarau vande. So, I pray to the ones who are the parents of the universe, Parvati Parameshwaram. That's basically how it goes. So, therefore, applying the logic that a word and its meaning cannot be separated, modernity and its underlying Western connotation cannot be separated, because it has at least half a millennium of history that informs the evolution of the word and what it has translated to. Specifically, what has it translated to? Every time you try to apply modernity to a non-Christian institution, the very premise is that that institution is outdated and is in serious need of reform. That's the premise with which you start. And therefore, you brand that particular institution traditional, orthodox, conservative, outdated, whatnot. And therefore, I refuse to use the word modernity. And consequently, the first response to your question, or the first level of response to your question, is that I am not interested in becoming modern, dare I say it. I wish to be relevant, not modern. Very, very clear. I wish to be contemporary, not modern. And I don't wish to subscribe to or live by the Western benchmark of what constitutes liberal. We have our own philosophy. And when you say that decoloniality is the journey that the civilization must embark upon, then the first thing that you do is to draw your values from within your own philosophy. So I am not going to try and find the Paryayvachi or the equivalent or the counterpart of liberalism in my philosophy. I would simply ask, what does my philosophy say independent of what the Western man has said? And I will ask myself, how do I make my own philosophy relevant and contemporary to the times that I live in, so that it is applicable to the challenges that I face and the realities I'm surrounded by? That is the only question you should be asking. I don't need to live by the standards or the benchmarks or the metrics set by the Westerner, period. That's one. Second, the point being made about the separation of the, let's say, state and church. Clearly, that's a Christian philosophy. Whether dharmic notions of state subscribe to the very same separation is a question that I'd like to ask. Because what is it that you are fundamentally asking? Whether the state is governed by the principles of dharma. And therefore, what is its treatment of people living in that particular region? And how does it choose to operate and how does it choose to define itself? Now, the problem is, when you apply separation of the state from the church, you are applying the framework of religion. When you are applying dharmic principles, first you start with the equation that dharma is not religion, and therefore a dharmic state is not necessarily a theocratic state. It is a state that is governed by principles of dharma, with dharma not being religion. Therefore, it is governed by certain principles which we believe are immutable and intransient and therefore universal. Okay? If you understand that particular premise, this constant dying need to fit Indian society into the Western model of the separation of the state and the church will immediately fall away, it will wither away. Now, where is all of this coming from? It comes from the notion that the Western society has been able to progress precisely because of its secular tendencies, and which means it has kept religion out of its political life, and therefore it has succeeded on the material front, is the assumption on the basis of which you operate, and that is where your question is coming from. Because you can't have something as a destination without asking yourself why this particular goal. So your goal is, I want to be like the Western society. Western societies seem to have achieved the ideal state of separation of the state and the church, and until I reach that particular state, I don't think I will reach the Western model of development, is your position. Now, this position is first of all ahistoric for multiple reasons, because you haven't understood how the separation of the church from the state works in the Western society itself. That's why I spent about 50 to 60 pages of the book dealing with this particular issue in significant detail, starting from biblical verses that address this particular issue, going to scholarly literature on the subject. There is not a single Western state that has chosen to abandon its Christian political theology or its Christian identity. That's a fact. You start with that fact. The moment you start with the factual premise that there is not a single Western state that has abandoned its Christian identity, the next question would be, how can you be a Christian state and still call yourself secular? If you happen to be secular, you shouldn't be having, let's say, a religious identity of your own. The problem is we have misunderstood secular. Secular has always been preceded, or there's a prefix which is constantly missing. It is Christian secular, not purely secular. Christian secularism translates to the following position. 1. The state shall have a very specific Christian identity, which means it will also have a very specific denominational identity. Catholic or Protestant. Within Protestant, you have the Lutheran Church or you have the Calvinist Church, and then subsequent denominations have come about. So you need to choose your identity. And the separation of the church from the state simply translates to not non-interference of religion with the state, but non-interference of the state with the activities of the church. So that particular policy was meant to insulate the church from political interference and from the interference of the state arm. It was meant to secure the freedom of religion and religious institutions from the state. Compare that with how we understand separation of the state from church in this country. So first of all, your understanding of what is secularism is wrong. How it applies in the mothership, therefore, Europe is incorrect. You have not understood that. And still we keep calling this secularism as the value by which we are all supposed to live by. So I refuse the second part of the question. I will reformulate the question as follows. If I have X number of philosophies which have given the best of scholarship possible on the nature of state and how it must conduct itself, and I have several baskets of options to choose from given the longevity of this particular civilization, Which of these principles can I pick and choose from to formulate a contemporary Bharat which is still operating within the four corners of dharma and which is still in a position to actively engage with the rest of the world without receding into its own shell? That is the, let's say, that is the goal that you should be aiming for. I don't wish to prove myself on your anvils. Okay? Now, how do you go about doing this? There is the second question. You cannot have an answer to this without sufficient preparation in this particular regard. And the kind of scholarship that went into this particular subject until 1947 is vastly more superior compared to the kind of scholarship that has been produced after 1947. In fact, after 1947, we have pushed ourselves further into the arms of coloniality, and therefore we have almost arrived at time T0, so you have to start from scratch again. Because the situation is so bad that people are not even aware of the existence of scholarship of the late 20th century or the early 21st century, where this was discussed over and over again. So the first job is to unlearn what you think you know, and then start applying this decoloniality as far as the question of the state is concerned. It will take at least another 15 to 20 years before this is ready. Because the acknowledgement of the problem itself seems to be a huge problem. Nobody wants to acknowledge the fact that they're living under the framework which doesn't resonate with our civilizational ethos. And we constantly try and ask ourselves this question, whether the civilization and the constitution enjoy the same relationship as India and Pakistan. Okay? And that is because you have not understood the creature called coloniality or colonial consciousness. So if at all someone were to ask me what is the central contribution of the book, it is not the identification of the problem, because that was already done by better scholars and much informed scholars. The contribution of the book is to push it into public discourse, and second, apply it specifically in the context of constitution, so that you're able to see both together. So the originality of the book significantly lies in connecting three different verticals: the literature on coloniality, the literature on civilization, and the literature on constitution, and bringing it under one roof. That's what I have done. And even if I say so myself, there's not a single book before which has done this. Because this particular literature has been consciously kept outside the scope of public discussion. Decolonial literature has been completely kept outside the scope of public discussion. Because India's academic departments have been hijacked by Nehruvian Marxism as well as post-colonialism, which have kept you outside and which have secluded this discussion completely from what has been happening in Latin America. So therefore, what I've asked in the book is, if Latin American societies have the freedom to apply a filter which allows them to explore their pre-colonial past, why is that freedom deprived of us? Why is it that we don't have the very same luxury to ask the very same questions? And if it is your logic that Latin American societies can look at their pre-Christian past, why can't I look at my pre-Christian, pre-Islamic past? What comes in the way? This bogey called secularism. And therefore, understanding this creature is very, very important, because that stands in the way of you and your ability to access your heritage. That is where I see the central contribution of the book. So let's reframe the question itself, and then we'll look at the right answers. Next.